so Mercedes is going to talk today about the nonprofit world and anything else you want to add about how your life is going. That'd be great too. So, thank you.
Thank you. Okay. So I'll get to a little bit about myself in the presentation because I think it's important to understand where I'm coming from with my conclusions. However, the facts which I'll present, the dates and times, they're not controversial, they're not in dispute, they are established fact. So just to say that I will talk a little bit about myself in the presentation. So let me go ahead and share my screen. And it could be a little rough, by the way. I ended up going through and wanting to explain a little bit more, but so there'll be time for questions at the end and hopefully they'll keep us on track. So welcome to the Pacifica Roundtable. It's June 3rd. I'm presenting from Chico, California, just Northern California for folks that don't know. And let's get going. So I've titled this, The Origins of the Nonprofit Industrial Complex on this continent. The reason that I say on this continent is because I'm going to jump back to before the United States was an established thing. And I'm going to hop around a little bit in there just to orient everybody with what has happened on this land to then give context to where I'll go with my conclusions. This is going to be a crash course. So bear with me as we get through it, and then feel free to do more reading on your own, ask questions, I can help direct. But so that's where we're going to hopefully go today. This is the disclaimer. I'm going to present information that's not common, but it is fact. I am going to tell you things that generally are not known by the public. And the conclusions that I've come to might be different from the ones that you're going to come to. And this is a conversation. It's the beginning of a discussion. And I welcome dissenting opinions, questions, and rebuttals to the conclusions which I will present. So I don't want anyone to feel like anything that I say is synchrosynced or that I am going to be personally hurt if you disagree. That's completely fine. So I wanted to establish that before moving forward. Okay. So the roadmap for today is I'll tell you a little bit about myself in terms of my professional experience. Then we'll do a little history of Colonia, and I'll explain what that means. Then I'll go to a little bit more about myself regarding my identities, then express my conclusions at this time, meaning that I reserve the right to change my mind at any time, given new information. And then we'll open it up for discussion and conversation. So we'll come back to that roadmap a couple of times just to orient and to tell you that this information was largely taken right out of the Introduction for the Revolution Will Not Be Funded, which is a book that you can purchase and read, or just read. I think it is available online. So just to also note that the order comes from that. Okay, so a little bit about my professional experience. I, for the last 3 years, have been the president of the board of directors for KZFR. I got on this board when I was 28. I'm about to turn 31. I've been president for the last 2 years. I was on the board of Theater on the Ridge, which is the oldest nonprofit theater company north of Sacramento all the way to the Canadian border. And I was on that board for 5 years, and I was the secretary of that board. So I have volunteer experience, and that started when I was 10 years old in 2000 until now. And I say that to say that I'm a community volunteer. I like to do that with my time. I'm AKA a crazy person. I work for free. And I volunteered so much that when I ran for city council in 2016, I was able to list my occupation as community volunteer. So I have some experience and some background in the nonprofit world, and that's reflected here. I have done nonprofit work with these 16 different organizations, and you can see some of the timelines. You don't have to look at all this. A lot of it is theater stuff and the environment, caring for the waterways and the park, and then trying to educate about science. And then in more recent years, with the winter shelters that we've done to try to house the unhoused during wintertime. But as you can see, I jumped around a little bit, but I did stay with a lot of these organizations for several years and still have good relationships with all of them. So just to say, yeah, I have experience in what I'm going to say, so that when I present my conclusion, it's not so like, who the hell are you? That's where I'm coming from here. Okay, coming back to the roadmap, we're going to go through the history of Colonia now. Oh, it's not moving. Okay, there we go. So 1492 to the present, kill the natives, take their land, also known as genocide and ethnocide, just to orient everybody that that is where the history of this continent starts at that point, colonization and the desecration of the people who inhabited this land. Of course, that's pre-USA, pre-nonprofit industrial complex, but part of the story. From the 1760s to the present, we have the United States of Capital, or the United States of America, capitalism, or America, as a lot of people like to call it. And I will explain these controversial things as well. So we're gonna keep going. So pre-Civil War, which is before the 1860s, organized charities weren't really a thing. Wealthy people would sometimes help other individuals who were disadvantaged. But there weren't established, organized charities at this time before the American Civil War. To orient us again here, we've got the enslavement and brutalization of people of Native American ancestry from the 1490s until the 1900s, which is not very commonly talked about. Then we have chattel slavery of African people who were kidnapped from their continent, the creation of Mexico in 1821, so it's not too long ago. Jim Crow laws implemented after people of African ancestry were released from slavery, which led to, of course, the new Jim Crow, mass incarceration. I don't know why there's a parenthesis there. The destruction of Black Wall Street 100 years ago, the Chinese Exclusion Act from 1882 to 1943. And then, of course, the internment of Japanese Americans. So this is just to orient us to the information that I'm going to share now, to explain the system, the paradigm that the nonprofit industrial complex is built on and around. That's what why this information is here, and to help orient in time with some other things that you might be familiar with. So in the 1860s, privatized local charities started forming here. First, it was the National Conference of Charities and Corrections. These were mostly religious people, politicians, and other community leaders, and people who were kind of celebrities that wanted to do something because it was fashionable to do. And of course, there were altruistic people who were less greedy and extremely wealthy, who genuinely wanted to help people for no other reason than the altruism of helping another human being. So I don't want to discount them. So this National Conference of Charities and Corrections formed, and then in 1917, it was renamed the National Conference of Social Welfare. So you might be familiar with that organization. In the early 1900s, a lot of people who were white colonizers had a lot of money, and they discovered, we don't want to pay taxes to the federal government. So they create, such as the Rockefellers, Andrew Carnegie, Russell Sage, and these people were referred to as robber barons. The definition of robber baron is a person who has become rich through ruthless and unscrupulous business practices, originally with reference to prominent US businessmen in the late 19th century. So they didn't want to pay taxes. They therefore created this way of creating charitable foundations in order to safeguard and hide their excess wealth that was built on the backs of slavery and genocide. So they created these foundations, and then they also wanted to make sure that poor people who vastly outnumbered them could not rise up against their awesome and terrible political power as plutocrats. So plutocracy means rule based on who has the most money, who has the most wealth. So plutocracy is what I argue this world is under capitalism, but I digress. So in the early 1900s, foundations came to exist to support these charities, which had formed in the 1870s. 1913, miners in Colorado united to push back against the exploitation of their labor with an organized strike. But that strike turned into mortal combat when the wealthy paid some of the other poor people to kill and intimidate the miners in exchange for some of that money trickling down on them. That was the beginning of some of these organized militias that were not specifically oriented around capturing people who were enslaved and trying to free themselves. So this happened, and I put this little quote: "These uppity laborers need to be kept in their place at the bottom of society. We richies should focus on keeping them from overthrowing us and taking back what has been stolen from them." So this is, again, the early 1900s, when there were lots of unions. People were trying to organize against capitalism and against this exploitative system. 1929 to 1939 is the Great Depression. Rich people hoarding money, but they don't know what true value is. So the stock market crashed. People start losing their goddamn minds. Poor people suffer because they don't own the means of production any longer, which are being mismanaged by the ignorant rich that don't have a connection to that labor. The Ford Foundation forms in 1936, very well-known organization, referenced heavily in this book, The Revolution Will Not Be Funded. They gave, by the way, 100% of the profits from the cars which were sold in Germany to Hitler. 1936. They also gave, the founder of the Ford Foundation gave Hitler $350,000 each year as a gift on his birthday. So this is just to keep things in the context of the paradigm of white supremacy and anti-Semitism too. The World War II happens, of course, 1939 to 1945. So when everything is being measured in money, in capitalism, war is that perfect way to be prosperous because it's an unnecessary buying and spending. And how does this relate? If you'll just bear with me and keep forward, we'll see. 1940s, President Truman signs the National Mental Health Act, and the American Federation of the Physically Handicapped forms. It became the first cross-disability national rights organization. And then in the 40s, Japanese Americans and people of Japanese ancestry were interned in concentration camps here in the US. That's still legal. So just so that nobody forgets, that is not illegal in the United States. That could happen again at any time. That hasn't been corrected. 1952 to 1954 is Brown versus the Board of Education. So while everybody is celebrating this in schools today, where, oh, in the 50s, things were becoming progressive, things were becoming enlightened, we were moving past bad race relations. Well, not really, because Japanese Americans were just interned. And so some people are getting rights. We have people with disabilities being granted greater status in society, being recognized as people. Simultaneously, we're interning the Japanese in this country. So, and then everyone should be able to access public schools. Okay, it seems enlightened. So all systemically and historically disenfranchised groups during this time are organizing for visible societal and political transformation. Some are achieving that and some aren't. From 1954 to 1968, we have the civil rights movement. And I have this in quotes because people of African-American ancestry and brown people have been organizing against chattel slavery and exploitation for the beginning of that exploitation and continue today. So when the civil rights movement is labeled as something that began on this date and ended on this date, it just is not quite accurate. So that's why that's in quotations there. The United Farm Workers Movement in 1962 of Cesar Chavez, Dolores Huerta, Gilbert Padilla, and other early organizers was forming, not to mention the Filipino workers who were also organizing at this time. And then we have the Civil Rights Act that prohibited discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. The provisions of the Civil Rights Act forbade discrimination on the basis of sex and or race in hiring, promoting, and firing. So at this point, the federal government's recognizing that it is politically wise to recognize historically and systemically oppressed groups and create protected classes. However, class itself is not one of them. And that's going to feed heavily into my conclusions about nonprofits, foundations, and the nonprofit industrial complex. So we're making leeway in some ways in Colonia at this time but there's still a lot that needed to be addressed. And meanwhile, charities and foundations are prospering, which we'll move into here. In 1962, Congressman Wright Patman of Texas conducted a study of foundations, and in reports he sent to the House of Representatives, he contended that economic power was consolidating in the hands of foundations. Foundations were being used to escape estate taxes, compensate relatives, and pay annuities to themselves. The IRS lacked the proper oversight over foundations. Foundations were controlling businesses to give them a competitive advantage over small businesses, and foundations were spending too much of their money overseas. So what happened was rich people on both sides of this political binary were interfering through foundations with grassroots efforts to effectively organize civil rights movements. So people on the extreme right hated foundations because they were helping the extreme left, and people on the extreme left hated foundations because people on the extreme right were furthering that cause. So there was this butting of heads politically, as evidenced here by Congressman Patman's words, that too much influence is being left in these private entities called foundations, and the federal government needs to get a handle on that. So this was in the 1960s. Congressman Wright Patman was a white man, and he was arguing that these organizations have way too much leverage over what happens in society, and that needs to be checked. In 1964, the CU demonstrators occupied Alcatraz Island. About 400 protesters occupied the island for 18 months to highlight how the US federal government's violation of treaties signed in 1868 required the return of Alcatraz to the CU. That was never done. That still hasn't been done. In 1964, the anti-war movement about Vietnam was growing, and people were organizing in solidarity with people of Asian descent. The Delano Grape Strike happens. So all of this stuff is happening while people are saying, hey, foundations and charities are having undue influence. And I'm just throwing this into the fray to orient you again to all of what's going on at the time. Filipino farm workers led by Larry Itlong voted to go on strike after decades of organizing, and later united with Chicano farm labor organizations, but you don't hear about that. And that's why I threw this in here too, is we always hear, oh, Cesar Chavez has, Cesar Chavez Day, but nobody really understands what that even meant and how many other people who are farm laborers were organizing against the institution at the time, and the institution being the United States federal government, private foundations, and private companies being ruled by the same people who were keeping all of these people in essentially slavery. So when we celebrate Cesar Chavez Day, don't forget Dolores Huerta is still alive. She was a huge founder with Cesar Chavez, and due to sexism has not gotten the recognition that she deserves. And also remember Filipino farm workers and others who labored then and still labor now in a lot of ways, so many people. So moving forward, we have Griswold versus Connecticut, a huge, oh, I'm losing my word. A Supreme Court case where birth control became a right for all married couples, which greatly revolutionizes society, but it's only married people. In 1968, the term Asian American is formed. That wasn't a term before. And they form political alliances here. Again, this is 20 years, less than 20 years after Japanese internment in the US. And so there's Asian American solidarity forming. And then we have Stonewall, which everybody celebrates from the 1960s, where people of LGBTQIA identity fought back against police brutality and were able to gain some rights and recognition. So that brings us in the same time period to the Tax Reform Act of 1969. And I know, just to stop for a minute, that this all might seem like, wait, that's not related to this, and this isn't related to that. Well, why are you throwing all this information? Like I said, it's a crash course, and I'll information bomb you, and then we can discuss and just facts here. So foundations were now getting too numerous in addition to being too powerful in 1969. Foundations were growing at a rate of 1,200 per year, and financial magazines routinely promoted foundations as tax havens for the extremely wealthy. The rise of foundation support accompanied the rise of groups that organized as formal 501c3 nonprofits because foundations could make tax-deductible donations to nonprofits. So this is where the federal government starts stepping in now to try to regulate and control that work, and therefore the money of foundations and nonprofits. So we at KZFR are a 501c3 nonprofit, and the 3 there means that we're not a 501c4 for people who aren't familiar with this structure. And so in the 3 bracket, we're not allowed to engage in calls to action or political activism directly through any of the work of our station. So that is a bureaucratic way of keeping money and efforts very bracketed. And I'll go into that a little bit more here. So let's move forward. Okay. Let's come back to the roadmap. So that was the history. And that just goes to the end of the 1960s. I'm going to jump in now and explain about myself as far as my intersectional identities go. And then I'm going to throw my conclusions at the group and then open it for discussion and conversation. That was a lot. There was a lot going on there. There's much more that I didn't include. You can read more if you're curious about something, but everything there that has a date on it is established. The commentary is my own, so I take responsibility for any of it that was inaccurate or callous, and I'm welcome the pushback on that if there is any at the end of the presentation. So I'm going to throw my conclusions out after I explain more about me. Okay. A reminder there that this is, you can read more and the revolution will not be funded. Okay, so I explained at the beginning of this presentation that I have an extensive background in volunteerism. That stems from privilege. I come from a place of extreme privilege in a lot of ways. I also come from a place of systemic disadvantage in many, many ways, but I'm not going to talk about those things today because I'm here to talk about how my privilege allows me to be a volunteer under capitalism and to do this work and therefore come to this conclusion that I'm going to offer in just a moment. So I'm going to hope to explain some of the privileges that I'm talking about here that have allowed me to do this work of volunteering in the nonprofit sector under a system that generally says if you do something for free, it doesn't have value or you don't have value. So I was born in 1990. I'm about to turn 31 years old. I'm Mexican-American, Chicanx, indigenous person of Tono Orom heritage on my mom's side, but I'm federally unrecognized. My family is not, we don't receive any kind of government reparations or money. And the tribe itself, which is still an established sovereign nation bordering Arizona, the US state of Arizona and Mexico, it's about, half and half on both sides. You might have heard about it in the struggle with the border wall situation. They don't recognize me or my family either. And that is part of my identity. And I can say more about that later if people are interested, but I do know my roots, even if my roots have been denied to me. I have cisgender privilege, meaning I was born with female anatomy and I identify with my female anatomy and I accept that as my identity. I have light skin privilege. I am a person of color, but I like to say that I'm a person of light color because we live in an anti-Black, anti-brown society. And half the year I'm considered a person of color when I'm tanned and half the year I'm white passing. So that's something that has allowed me to engage in volunteer work, both of those things, to a large extent that I'm acceptable in this society, the way I look. I have able-bodied privilege, meaning that I can physically do labor. I can physically get myself to places and perform labor and work and interact with others in a normal way. So I have able-bodied privilege. I don't have a debilitating disease of any kind. And I've had healthcare privilege all of my life. My mom worked for the California Highway Patrol, which is a state agency. And because of her hard work, I have been covered by adequate health care all my life and treatment for the diseases which I do have. And that's a huge privilege that's enabled me to give of myself in a volunteer way, because without that treatment, I would be bedridden with how severe my asthma is. I've had dental care privilege, allowing me to have super straight, super healthy, super clean looking teeth. And that is smile privilege in this society. People don't recognize it. Maybe now you do. We have a very superficial society, and the way that I present has allowed me access to places that might otherwise I'd be treated differently or not. You know, oh, we don't want you at the front desk. Oh, we don't want you as a hostess, or oh, we don't want you as a docent. And those things are never, no one's ever going to say to you, no, because your teeth are bad. However, I recognize that I'm treated very complimented and treated well based on my dental care privilege. And I haven't had that. You know, I had to have years of braces and stuff. So this just things I'm throwing out. So maybe you're like, this is too much, but I do want to recognize all these privileges. I have right-handed privilege. I went to Catholic school, and people who were left-handed were, you know, beaten for that. And my mom experienced that in Catholic school. But in this world, everything's tailored to me as a right-handed person. That's something people don't often think about. I have sighted privilege. I'm able to observe the world through my eyes and see color and see culture and participate in the world in that way, whereas a lot of people don't have that. I also have hearing privilege. I'm able to hear you all today, and I'll be able to hear the comments that you're sharing in your experiences. That's a huge privilege that's denied to a lot of people. Sighted privilege, hearing privilege. I have literacy privilege and education privilege. As I mentioned, I went to Catholic school. I went to private Roman Catholic school from kindergarten through 10th grade. And based on that, my class level has been elevated in ways that my cousins haven't had. We have the same ancestry, we have the same background, but because of my education privilege and my literacy privilege, I've been able to navigate this world in a different way than they have. I'm a citizen of this country, and I have citizenship privilege and all the privileges that come with that as a United States citizen. And I have passport privilege that I can pretty much travel anywhere in the world. That's only been not true because of COVID-19 and the irresponsibility of the United States government and people here and the entitlement we have. Now I have less passport privilege, but that's still a huge privilege that I think I can go anywhere in the world. A lot of people don't have that. I'm a non-immigrant. My father was an immigrant to this country from Mexico, and English was not his first language. He had to learn that. He had to pass all this stuff. I have linguistic privilege. I speak without an accent. And by say without an accent, I've got my California accent, which is recognized kind of as the non-accent. And so I am able to be respected and viewed as whatever I'm saying might be legitimate, whereas there's huge discrimination against people with accents from different parts of the world or people from the South in the US. You know, there's that common thing that if you speak with an accent, you're dumb. And that is absolutely a privilege that I enjoy in a discriminatory world that says these crazy things. So I just wanted to say that. I have geographical privilege and transportation privilege. Based on where I live, I have access to everything that I need. And I have a car, I have ability to drive, I have a bicycle, I have my feet. I live in a flat geographical area here in Chico. I'm able to move where I want, go where I want. If I need to leave for some reason, I can do that. A lot of people don't have that, as we can see with the refugee crisis. I am employed full-time. I've been employed full-time since I was 15 years old. That's a huge privilege. I don't have any gaps in my employment history. I have housed privilege. I am finally not homeless. And I say that I've been homeless a couple of times in my life and lived in a car at different times. And now I'm housed in a beautiful home with my family, and it's great. I have family privilege. The people who are biologically related to me, although I don't speak to my father's side due to years of abuse, my family on my mom's side is very loving, nurturing, connecting, supporting. And that is a privilege denied to so many people, foster care people, people who are adopted, and then also people who just don't have that family support for whatever reasons. So to conclude with this, I have basic needs privilege, which allows me and enables me to volunteer. So volunteering is itself a privilege that most people who are young, most people who are poor, most people who are people of color are not able to do. And what do we know in this capitalistic society? That volunteer experience on your resume is a huge boost, right? Being able to do an unpaid internship, for example. Can't do that if you don't have your basic needs met. So I'm truly grateful for all the privileges which I enjoy, but I don't want to be blind to the fact that I benefit from all of these discriminatory, awful systems, which then allow me to do the work of giving back. And I just, my air quotations are the thing of the day for this presentation, because a lot of this is linguistic. I'm a recovering Roman Catholic. Like I said, I went to Catholic school from K to 10. Identify as an atheist, and I have spiritual atheism, and people want to talk about that. But again, this is where I'm coming from. I believe in social democracy, leaning toward anarchism. Not, it's another conversation too. If people want to have it self-sovereignty or satyagraha, this kind of self-reliance thing. So there's that. Okay. My work in the nonprofit world. Thank you for bearing with me on that. I hope it'll contribute to discussion. A nonprofit or a non-governmental organization, NGO, or that's in the rest of the world, not the United States. The IRS defines nonprofit as a religious, charitable, scientific, or educational organization whose receipts are tax exempt and whose contributions are tax deductible. Organizations must secure a 501c3 or 4 status to receive foundational grants, and they are prohibited from direct involvement in political advocacy. So this does specifically relate to 501c3s, of which my organization, KZFR, as a community radio station, is a part. We have an educational designation out of those 4 designations. And the question then becomes who and which groups or organizations can hoard money and who can't. Here's my conclusion from all this information I presented to you. Which groups can hoard money and who can't? Nonprofits quell social movements. Foundations began to take a role in shaping this organizing so that social protest would not challenge the capitalist status quo. Robert L. Allen, as early as 1969, warned of the co-optation of the Black Power movement by foundations. Nonprofits quell social movements. During the late 1960s, radical movements for social change were transforming the shape of the United States, while third world liberation movements were challenging Western imperialism. So I'm going to move forward in just a minute, but this is where all of those different social movement organizing efforts should or could enter into your mind, that I invite you to think about. Black struggle, Asian struggle, Native American struggle, Mexican struggle, LGBTQIA struggle, people with disabilities struggle, all women's struggles. All of these things were happening and coming to this head in society. And the government created a system, and the federal government created this system through the IRS, whereby in order to get money from private foundations that were funneling public money into private organizations, you had to apply for bureaucratic membership. So you have to obey the hierarchy. You have to abide by our restrictions and our rules. So again, I'm going to say nonprofits quell social movements. Quell is to put an end to a rebellion or another disorder, typically by the use of force, to subdue or silence someone, to suppress, generally a feeling, especially an unpleasant one, So again, my conclusion from all of these facts that I study as a sociologist is that nonprofits quell social movements. Foundation grants and nonprofit bureaucracy. I see there's a chat. Let me look really quickly here. Okay. Gosh, I hope I haven't taken that long. Okay. So foundation grants and nonprofit bureaucracy is the last little piece of this I'm going to tack on before we move to discussion. So, oh, is it moving? What happened here? Okay. So the Black liberation movement, as I mentioned, was co-opted and turned into Black capitalism. Buy Black, sell Black, support Black businesses. Well, okay. The native sovereignty movement of trying to get treaties honored turned into native capitalism, casinos, and other efforts of trying to participate in capitalism and funnel money back into these impoverished communities. Overthrow and overhaul efforts of the government turned into policy reform efforts. So rather than recreate the system, let's just try to tweak it, this gradualism that MLKJ spoke about. So the grassroots working class solidarity movement that was occurring at that time between all of these different poor people was turned instead into professionalism. You need to get a degree, you need to have a certification, you need to have some kind of outside person or entity affirm what legitimize the work that you're doing. Otherwise, we're not going to respect what you say in your lived experience. So that lived experience wisdom was co-opted into academia and certification, which we see now. So essentially, foundations provide a cover for white supremacy. They provide a cover for plutocracy. They're reminiscent of Rockefeller's strategy, where people of color deserve individual relief, but people of color who organize to end white supremacy are a menace to society. So that's my conclusion. I think I just had two other slides that unfortunately a belief has today sprung up that your private character has nothing to do with your public activity. I believe this superstition must go. Our public workers must set about the task of reforming society by reforming themselves first. So the spiritual weapon of self-purification, intangible as it seems, is the most potent means of revolutionizing one's environment and loosening external shackles. It works subtly and invisibly. It is an intense process, though it may often seem a weary and long-drawn process. It is the straightest way to liberation, the surest and quickest, and no effort can be too great for it. And that's from Gandhi, who was a problematic figure in a lot of ways as well. So everything's political, and personal alignment is the very end of this presentation. This is the last slide of what did nonprofits do? What are you doing in a nonprofit? Analyzing that, sitting back with yourself and saying, why am I here? What are my priorities? Once you know those things, orienting and identifying which groups you belong to, which groups you don't belong to, who are you fighting, who or what are you fighting against, who or what are you fighting for or with, defining what it is that matters to you, and then implementing those things in real life. So not just armchair philosophizing and thinking, oh, I value diversity. Okay, how are you going to enact that in your own life is so important in this nonprofit work that in this volunteerism that we're engaged with, and that self-alignment. And then start back from the beginning. That is how I navigate my conclusion that nonprofits and the nonprofit industrial complex with foundations quell social revolution, is to remember that I'm in the system, trying to fight the system. And that's how I counter my own conclusion. So that's the end of this presentation.
Wow, thank you, Mercedes.